Welcome to Boston Review of Books. Today's article is the preface to the revised and enlarged edition of Qin Hui's book The Leviathan That Devours, Nora, Feminism and the Path of Chinese Women, published by Japan's Read Dao Society. The original text is quite long, below is the final section. Escaping Problem Colonialism. In the 11 months since the first edition of this book was published, while it has sparked discussion, the similar crimes mentioned in the book have continued to occur. And in some cases, have even intensified. Just a few days ago, the case of the Shaanxi female master's degree holder abducted for 13 years, with the abductor found not guilty, once again ignited widespread public outrage and heated debate. A woman surnamed Bu, who holds a master's degree in engineering, went missing in 2011 due to mental illness. She was picked up by someone, and after being introduced several times, was taken in. These are the exact terms used by official explanations of the case, by a lame, one-eyed blind bachelor named Zhang in a remote mountain village in Hechuan County. Without ever obtaining a marriage certificate, she gave birth to one son and one daughter over the next 13 years, reportedly one of the children was even sold. During this period, Zhang not only raped her himself repeatedly but also allowed other men in the village to rape the female master's degree holder 7 times, sometimes right in front of him, yet never reported it to the police. As a result, she developed extreme aversion to men and became unable to recognize people. 13 years later, when her family finally rescued her and brought her home, her elderly father tried to embrace her and weep together in reunion. Only to be violently pushed away by his daughter, whose mental illness had been severely exacerbated by years of abuse. She screamed at him, cursing him as an old lecher. Thus, after more than a year of trial proceedings, the judicial authorities in Hechuan County reached their conclusion on January 22, 2026. Zhang Mojuan engaged in sexual relations with Bu Momu and had children with her, with the subjective intention of establishing a family and living together with her. Therefore, they decided not to prosecute. The media summed up the fundamental logic of this non-prosecution decision as, rape committed with the subjective intent of forming a family is not a crime. Is this not even more absurd and unthinkable than the verdict 4 years ago in the chained woman case, where Dong was convicted only of domestic abuse? If, in today's postmodern feminist perspective, the problems facing Chinese women are still limited to things like workplace sexual harassment, unpaid housework, and the like, then when will atrocities of this kind ever come to an end? In fact, the misplacement of problems does not occur only between different countries. Feminism, and human rights issues more broadly, do not encompass the entirety of social life. There is no doubt that in recent decades, China has taken on a very large share of the global industrial chain through globalization, achieving tremendous economic development. Despite all kinds of injustices, people, including the disadvantaged poor and women, have seen clear and substantial improvements in their material living standards. However, just as Yang Guifei d. 756, the renowned imperial consort of Tang Emperor Xuanzong, enjoyed luxuries and delicacies that the common people could scarcely imagine, yet this did not mean she possessed human rights, including so-called rights to subsistence, or women's rights. So too today's human rights and women's rights problems in China will not be eliminated merely by economic development. That said, some urban white-collar women at the forefront of this economic tide now live in environments comparable to those of women in developed countries. It is therefore entirely natural for them to resonate with postmodern feminism, and this resonance is not necessarily a case of problem misplacement. But we must not forget that China's recent past was not like this, and the main body of society today is still not entirely like this either. To treat postmodern feminist issues as the entirety of today's Chinese women's issues, or even as the entirety of China's problems. And worse still, to use a postmodern feminist lens to explain China's past, would constitute a serious misplacement of problems. That is why I believe China should have its own #MeToo, but even more importantly, it should have its own #Tian2. Not only must we fight for this ourselves, in this era of globalization, especially as China's influence on globalization grows ever greater, them too should hear our voices. This is precisely the motivation behind my writing this book, and behind the decision, after the first edition, to now substantially revise and enlarge it for republication. I do not believe in cultural determinism, nor do I think that the yearning for freedom is merely a Western cultural trait while Chinese culture inherently yearns for imprisonment. Of course, I also absolutely do not believe that only Nora pursues women's rights, while Xianglin Sa or the chained woman willingly adheres to ritual propriety and feudal morality, but why is it that some nations have been relatively successful in striving for freedom, while others seem trapped in endless cycles of the six realms, perpetually unable to escape the strange loop? Especially when one nation, A, deliberately sets out to learn from another nation, B, yet repeatedly ends up trying to draw a tiger but producing something more like a dog. In my view, this is probably not a matter of cultural genes, that is, some inherent superiority or inferiority embedded in the entire nation's character. Every nation, after all, contains both outstanding individuals and stubborn or vicious ones. That is another question altogether. Rather, it is fundamentally a question of path dependence and path choice, of course, combined with issues such as windows of historical opportunity, and so on. And many of the path choices that lead to diametrically opposite outcomes, going south while aiming north, are closely related to the misplacement of problems. Today, terms like Western cultural hegemony and post-colonial context have become hot buzzwords. If these concepts still carry any real meaning, it is certainly not in the way some people, said Homi Bhabha, Kojin Karatani, and others, have framed it, that is, as the West having force-fed us an excess of so-called Western values such as freedom, democracy, human rights, women's rights, and so on. Rather, the opposite is true, precisely because they themselves harbor such deep aversion to what they call Western values, they have inundated us with far too many Western problems. Their social critique may indeed be profound in their own context, but it never addresses, and in fact severely obscures, the genuine problems we actually face, many of which they themselves once confronted, but which their own forebears resolved through immense effort, only for later generations to forget their ancestors' hard-won achievements. More than 20 years ago, I coined the term problem colonialism to describe this pathology. Later I felt that colonialism was too strong. After all, no one forced it upon us. We ourselves were the ones who failed to digest what we imported from abroad, so I changed it to misplacement of problems. But looking at the situation now, those who keep misplacing problems are indeed inveterate name-droppers, forever speaking of Greece in every breath. So perhaps problem colonialism is not entirely off the mark after all. I am a liberal, and I do not reject socialism, I only oppose the Qin system wrapped in socialist packaging. But my principle is this: isms can be imported, problems must be homegrown. This applies equally to the question of women's rights. After the publication of the first edition of this book, it received attention from many friends, including a considerable number of valuable criticisms. Two female scholars, Professor Zhou Xiao and Professor Nia Lili, kindly contributed prefaces, which is especially commendable because their prefaces include substantial points of discussion and disagreement. I have always believed that purely perfunctory prefaces, postscripts, or reviews may help with commercial promotion, but they hold little academic significance. When I write prefaces for others, I prefer to use the occasion to raise issues and stimulate debate. So when Professor Nia asked whether she could include differing views, I replied that this was exactly what I had hoped for. I would like to express my special thanks here. Of course, the publication of this book would not have been possible without the multifaceted assistance of friends such as Mr. Tsuchiya Masaki, Mr. Nakamura Tatsuo, Mr. Stephen, Mr. Jean Bin, Ms. Ayun, and others in translation, republication, and other aspects. I extend my gratitude to them all at once.